They said I wasn't good enough for their daughter, but when my father stepped up to that microphone and the room fell silent, everything changed. The crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across the marble floor of the Riverside Country Club, where 200 guests sat beneath ivory draping and cascading orchids. I stood there in my rented tuxedo, watching my new mother-in-law's face twist with barely concealed disgust as she whispered something to her sister. The September air carried the scent of gardenias and something else I couldn't quite name, something that felt like impending storm clouds gathering on what should have been the happiest day of my life. My hands trembled slightly as I adjusted my tie, the same nervous gesture I'd been making since childhood whenever I felt like I didn't belong. But that was before everything I thought I knew about my place in this world shattered into a million pieces, before the man I'd spent 15 years resenting walked through those mahogany doors and reminded everyone exactly who I really was. The truth has a way of surfacing when you least expect it, like morning fog lifting to reveal a landscape you never knew existed. That day, in front of everyone who had ever made me feel small, I learned that sometimes the people who love us most are the ones we understand the least. The memory of what happened next still gives me chills, because it proved that family isn't always about the people who stayed. Sometimes it's about the ones who are always there, watching from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to step into the light. Before I share what happened that day, I want to know you're here with me. Just say listening in the comments or let me know where you are watching from. I love hearing how far these stories reach, because sometimes we all need to be reminded that our worth isn't determined by the people who can't see it. The morning of my wedding started like any other Saturday, except for the knot in my stomach that had been growing tighter for weeks. I woke up in my studio apartment above the auto repair shop where I worked, the same place I'd been living since graduating community college with a degree in automotive technology. The walls were thin enough that I could hear Mrs. Chin next door making her morning tea, a sound that had become oddly comforting over the past 3 years. Sunlight streamed through the single window, highlighting the oil stains on my work clothes that hung over the back of my only chair. Sarah had been after me to find a better place, something more suitable for a married couple, but the truth was this cramped space above the garage was all I could afford on my mechanic's salary. I pulled on my best khakis and the button-down shirt Sarah had picked out for me, trying to ignore the way my reflection looked back at me with doubt in his eyes. The wedding was still 6 hours away, but already I felt like an imposter preparing for a role I wasn't sure I could play. Sarah came from the kind of family where Sunday dinners were served on china that had been passed down for generations, where conversations revolved around stock portfolios and vacation homes in the Hamptons. Her father owned 3 car dealerships and a commercial real estate company, while her mother served on the boards of half a dozen charitable organizations. They lived in a house with more bathrooms than my apartment had rooms, and every time I visited, I felt like I was touring a museum where I wasn't allowed to touch anything. The contrast between our worlds had never been more obvious than during the wedding planning process. While Sarah and her mother debated between salmon and ivory for the table linens, I sat quietly in corner chairs, nodding when asked for my opinion about flowers I couldn't pronounce and menu items that cost more than I made in a week. Mrs. Hartford, Sarah's mother, had a way of looking at me that made me feel like a stain on her perfectly polished life, though she was always careful to maintain a facade of politeness when Sarah was around. During our private moments, however, her true feelings came through in subtle digs about my background, my job, my family situation. My family situation was complicated in ways that even I didn't fully understand. My mother had raised me alone after my father left when I was 12, and she'd done her best with what little we had. She worked double shifts at the diner to keep food on the table and clothes on my back, never complaining about the sacrifices she made or the dreams she put aside. We lived in a tiny 2-bedroom house on the wrong side of town, where sirens were our lullabies and gunshots punctuated our conversations. Mom always told me that Dad had been a dreamer, a man with big ideas who couldn't handle the reality of being a father and a husband. She never spoke badly of him, but I could see the hurt in her eyes whenever his name came up, the way she would quickly change the subject or find something urgent that needed doing. The last time I saw my father, I was 17 and angry at the world. He'd shown up at our front door wearing a suit that probably cost more than our monthly rent, driving a car that looked like it belonged in a magazine. He wanted to take me to lunch, to talk about my future, to discuss opportunities one might be interested in pursuing. But I was too hurt, too proud, too stubborn to listen. I accused him of abandoning us, of choosing money over family, of thinking he could buy his way back into my life with expensive gifts and empty promises. The argument escalated until I told him I never wanted to see him again, that as far as I was concerned, I didn't have a father. The look in his eyes when I said those words still haunted me 15 years later, a mixture of pain and understanding that I was too young and angry to appreciate at the time. Mom never knew about the college fund that mysteriously appeared when I turned 18, or the anonymous scholarship that covered my community college tuition. She never questioned how the rent always seemed to get paid during her occasional bouts of illness, or how the grocery bill somehow balanced itself during particularly tight months. I suspected, but I never asked, because part of me didn't want to know if the father I'd rejected was still trying to take care of us from a distance. Pride was a luxury we couldn't afford, but it was the only thing we had left, and I wore it like armor against a world that seemed determined to remind me of everything I lacked. Sarah knew bits and pieces of my story, but I'd never told her the whole truth about my father or the complicated feelings I carried about his absence. She knew I came from humble beginnings, that money had always been tight, that I'd worked my way through school while living at home to help support my mother. What she didn't know was how much those early years had shaped my sense of self-worth, how deeply I'd internalized the message that I wasn't enough, that I would never be enough, that loving someone like Sarah was reaching beyond my station in life. Her family's reaction to our engagement had been polite but lukewarm, like receiving congratulations written in disappearing ink. Mr. Hartford shook my hand with the grip of a man who was used to measuring other people's worth in handshakes, while Mrs. Hartford smiled the kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes. Sarah's younger sister Emma was the only one who seemed genuinely happy for us, though even she couldn't hide her surprise that Sarah had chosen someone so far outside their social circle. The wedding planning became a delicate dance of compromise, where every decision felt like a negotiation between two different worlds that spoke different languages. The venue selection had been the first major battle. Sarah initially wanted something small and intimate, maybe the garden behind her family's house or a rustic barn outside the city. But Mrs. Hartford had other ideas, insisting that the Hartford family wedding needed to reflect their position in the community. The Riverside Country Club was where generations of Hartford family milestones had been celebrated, where business deals were made over 18 holes and social hierarchies were maintained over Sunday brunch. The deposit alone was more than I made in 3 months, but Mr. Hartford insisted on handling all the wedding expenses, a gesture that felt more like charity than generosity. I spent my lunch breaks looking at the pictures Sarah would send me of floral arrangements and cake designs, trying to summon enthusiasm for details that felt as foreign to me as a language I'd never learned. The guest list grew from 50 to 100 to 200 people, most of whom I'd never met, but who apparently needed to witness Sarah Hartford marrying the mechanic from across town. My own guest list was embarrassingly short: Mom, my cousin Jake who lived in Detroit, and 3 guys from the shop who I wasn't even sure would show up in suits. The bachelor party had been particularly awkward, with Sarah's brother-in-law insisting on taking me to an exclusive steakhouse where the menu had no prices and the wine cost more per bottle than I spent on groceries in a month. Her friends' husbands were nice enough, but their conversation revolved around golf handicaps and stock options, topics that might as well have been quantum physics for all the understanding I brought to them. They were polite in the way that well-bred people are always polite, asking about my work with the kind of interest that felt more anthropological than genuine. When they talked about their own jobs in finance and real estate and corporate law, I nodded along and tried to contribute when I could, but mostly I just felt like an exhibit at a museum dedicated to people who belong somewhere I never would. The morning of the wedding, Mom called to wish me luck and to tell me how proud she was of the man I'd become. Her voice carried that special kind of love that only mothers possess, the kind that sees through all your flaws and failures to something worthy underneath. She'd wanted to help with the wedding expenses, had even offered to take out a second mortgage on the house, but I couldn't let her sacrifice any more than she already had. Instead, she'd sewn buttons back onto my suit jacket and hemmed my pants with the same careful attention she'd given to my school clothes when I was young and growing too fast for our budget to keep up. By the time I arrived at the country club, the transformation was complete. The ballroom that had been empty the day before now looked like something from a fairy tale, with flowers cascading from every surface and candles flickering in crystal holders. The staff moved with practiced efficiency, making final adjustments to place settings and checking sound systems, while the photographer set up equipment in corners that would capture every angle of what promised to be a spectacular celebration. I stood in the groom's room, adjusting my bow tie for the 100th time, when Sarah's father knocked on the door. Mr. Hartford entered with the kind of confidence that comes from a lifetime of walking into rooms where you know you belong. His tuxedo fit like it had been sewn directly onto his body, and his shoes were shined to a degree that seemed almost aggressive. He looked around the small preparation room with the eye of a man accustomed to inspecting things for flaws, then settled his gaze on me with an expression I couldn't quite read. We stood there for a moment in the kind of silence that feels loaded with unspoken expectations, before he finally spoke. The conversation that followed was polite on the surface, but carried undertones that cut deeper than any direct insult could have managed. He talked about responsibility and commitment, about the importance of being able to provide for a family, about the challenges that came with marrying above your circumstances. His words were carefully chosen, wrapped in the language of fatherly concern, but the message was clear. I wasn't what he'd envisioned for his daughter, and he wanted to make sure I understood the magnitude of what I was taking on. By the time he left, I felt like I'd been measured against a standard I could never hope to reach and found wanting in ways I couldn't even name. Sarah looked radiant when I saw her walking down the aisle, a vision in white silk and family pearls that had been worn by 3 generations of Hartford women. Her smile was nervous but genuine, and for a moment, all my doubts and insecurities faded away in the face of her beauty and the love I saw reflected in her eyes. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of traditional vows and classical music, presided over by the same minister who had officiated at her parents' wedding 30 years earlier. When we kissed as husband and wife, the applause felt warm and sincere, and I allowed myself to believe that maybe love really could conquer the differences that seemed to loom so large in my mind. The reception began beautifully, with cocktails served on the terrace overlooking the golf course and the river beyond. The late afternoon sun painted everything in golden light, and the string quartet Sarah had insisted on created an elegant backdrop for conversation and laughter. I made my rounds through the crowd, shaking hands and accepting congratulations from people whose names I'd never remember and whose faces would blur together in my memory. For a while, it felt like we might actually pull this off, like I might actually belong in this world of country club elegance and inherited confidence. But as the evening wore on and the alcohol flowed more freely, the carefully maintained facade began to crack. Comments that started as gentle teasing grew sharper around the edges, jokes about oil stains and blue-collar wages that carried just enough truth to sting. Mrs. Hartford held court at the head table, regaling her friends with stories about the wedding planning process that somehow always seemed to highlight how different Sarah's choice in husbands was from what anyone might have expected. Her laughter tinkled like expensive crystal, beautiful and brittle and somehow cutting. The moment that changed everything happened during the traditional parent speeches, when Mrs. Hartford rose from her seat with a champagne glass in her hand and a smile that could have cut glass. She began with all the appropriate words about love and happiness and bright futures, but as she continued, her tone shifted into something that felt more like a warning than a blessing. She talked about the importance of knowing one's place in the world, about the value of realistic expectations, about the challenges that arise when people try to reach beyond their natural circumstances. The room grew quiet in the way that crowds do when they sense conflict approaching, conversations dying away until the only sounds were the clink of silverware against china and the distant hum of kitchen staff preparing the next course. Sarah's face flushed red with embarrassment, and I could see her struggling to decide whether to interrupt her mother or let the speech continue to its inevitable conclusion. The other guests shifted in their seats, some looking down at their plates while others watched with the kind of fascination usually reserved for car accidents and natural disasters. When Mrs. Hartford finally raised her glass in a toast, her eyes found mine across the room with laser precision. Her final words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that everyone could smell, but no one wanted to acknowledge. To Sarah and her new husband, may they always remember to know their place in this world and find happiness within their means. The applause that followed was polite but scattered, the kind of response that comes from people who aren't sure whether they've just witnessed a blessing or a subtle assassination. I felt the blood drain from my face as the full weight of her words settled over the room like a blanket soaked in cold water. This wasn't just a mother-in-law making an awkward speech at her daughter's wedding. This was a public declaration that I didn't belong, that my marriage to Sarah was somehow a violation of the natural order, that I should be grateful for whatever scraps of acceptance her family might occasionally throw my way. The shame burned in my chest like acid, made worse by the fact that part of me wondered if she might be right, if I really had reached too high and married above my station. That's when I heard the commotion near the entrance to the ballroom, voices carrying a note of surprise and recognition that seemed to ripple through the crowd like a stone thrown into still water. Heads turned toward the mahogany doors where a figure stood silhouetted against the light from the hallway, tall and imposing in a way that commanded attention without demanding it. I couldn't see his face clearly from where I stood, but something about his presence made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, made my heart start beating faster for reasons I couldn't explain. The string quartet had stopped playing, and even the wait staff had paused in their duties to see what had caused this sudden shift in the room's energy. The figure stepped forward into the light, and my world tilted on its axis as I recognized the face I hadn't seen in 15 years, but still visited in my dreams. Time seemed to freeze as I stared at the man who had walked out of my life when I was 12 years old and back into it at the moment I needed him most. He looked older, distinguished in a way that spoke of success and confidence, but his eyes held the same gentle intelligence I remembered from childhood bedtime stories and Saturday morning pancakes. The years had been kind to him, adding silver to his temples and lines around his eyes that suggested a life lived fully, but there was something else there too, something that looked like regret mixed with a father's enduring love. He wore his formal attire like armor, every detail perfect from his platinum cufflinks to his handcrafted Italian shoes. Yet, somehow he managed to look completely natural in a room full of people who spent their lives trying to achieve that same effortless elegance. The recognition spread through the crowd like wildfire, whispers building from table to table as people began to place the face they were seeing with names they'd read in business magazines and financial newspapers. I watched in stunned silence as Mrs. Hartford's expression shifted from smug satisfaction to confusion to something that looked dangerously close to panic. Her champagne glass trembled slightly in her hand, and I could see her mind racing as she tried to process what his presence might mean and how it might change the narrative she'd been so carefully crafting about her daughter's unfortunate choice in husbands. Sarah grabbed my arm with a grip that would leave bruises, her fingernails digging into my jacket as she leaned close enough for me to feel her breath against my ear. Her voice came out as a whisper, but it carried the weight of 1,000 unasked questions. "Is that your father? The one you said walked out? The one you never talk about?" I nodded, not trusting my voice to work properly, watching as the man I'd spent 15 years hating made his way through the crowd with the kind of confidence that comes from owning rooms like this one, from being the person others defer to without question. The memories came flooding back like a dam had burst inside my head, carrying with them all the complicated emotions I'd spent years trying to suppress. I was 12 again, watching from my bedroom window as my father loaded suitcases into the trunk of a car I'd never seen before, his movements quick and efficient like he was trying to escape before something caught up with him. Mom had tried to explain it in terms a 12-year-old could understand, talking about dreams and responsibilities and sometimes how people who love each other need to be apart for a while. But 12-year-old logic is unforgiving, and all I understood was that my father had chosen something else over staying with us, over staying with me. What I didn't know then, what I was too young and hurt to understand, was that my father hadn't left because he didn't love us. He'd left because he loved us too much to watch us struggle in poverty while he chased dreams that seemed impossible from where we stood. The man who walked out that day wasn't running away from responsibility. He was running toward it, carrying the weight of our family's future on his shoulders like Atlas carrying the world. But children don't understand sacrifice when it looks like abandonment, and teenagers don't appreciate love when it feels like rejection. The truth was that my father had always been a visionary, a man who saw possibilities where others saw problems, opportunities where others saw obstacles. Even when we were living paycheck to paycheck in that tiny house, he would stay up late at the kitchen table sketching ideas and filling notebooks with business plans and patent applications. Mom would bring him coffee and rub his shoulders while he worked, believing in his dreams even when the electric bill was overdue and the refrigerator was nearly empty. He talked about revolutionary technologies and game-changing innovations with the passion of a true inventor, but passion doesn't pay rent and dreams don't put food on the table. The night before he left, I'd heard them arguing in hushed voices, their words carrying through the thin walls of our house like secrets I wasn't supposed to know. Mom was crying, which scared me more than the yelling would have, because Mom never cried where we could see her. Dad's voice was low and urgent, talking about opportunities and investors and timing that couldn't wait. He kept saying, "This is our chance, and I can give you everything, and just trust me one more time." But Mom had trusted him so many times before, had believed in so many schemes that never materialized, had watched him chase so many dreams that led nowhere except deeper into debt. When I confronted him that morning, standing in the driveway in my pajamas with tears streaming down my face, he tried to explain it in a way that would make sense to a 12-year-old boy whose world was falling apart. He knelt down to my level, his hands on my shoulders, and told me that sometimes fathers have to make hard choices to take care of their families. He promised he would be back, that everything he was doing was for us, that someday I would understand why this was necessary. But promises from adults are just words to children, and words don't fill the empty spaces left behind when someone important disappears from your life. The years that followed were a blur of struggle and sacrifice, with Mom working double shifts to keep us afloat while I learned to be the man of the house at an age when I should have been worried about homework and video games. We never talked about Dad except in practical terms, like when I needed his signature for school forms or when the occasional birthday card arrived with no return address. The cards always contained just enough money to cover whatever crisis we were facing at the moment, which felt less like generosity and more like guilt trying to buy its way back into our good graces. High school brought its own challenges, with me working part-time jobs to help with expenses while watching my classmates worry about prom dates and college applications. I was good with my hands, better with tools than with textbooks, so automotive technology seemed like a natural fit for someone who needed to start earning a living as soon as possible. The community college program was practical and affordable, and I could live at home to help take care of Mom, who had developed arthritis from all those years of standing on her feet at the diner. What I didn't realize until much later was how my father's absence had shaped every decision I made, every relationship I formed, every dream I allowed myself to have. I chose safe paths over ambitious ones, settled for enough over reaching for more, convinced myself that wanting too much was what had torn our family apart in the first place. The fear of abandoning the people I loved the way my father had abandoned us kept me tethered to a life that felt smaller than the one I might have chosen if I'd been braver or more confident in my own worth. The scholarship that paid for my community college tuition came from a foundation I'd never heard of, with requirements so specific they might as well have been written just for me. Single-parent household, demonstrated financial need, interest in automotive technology, essay about overcoming adversity. It was like someone had studied my life and created a funding opportunity designed to fit my exact circumstances. The counselor who helped me apply said she'd never seen anything like it, that most scholarships were broader in scope and more competitive in nature. But I was 18 and desperate for any help I could get, so I didn't ask too many questions about guardian angels bearing gifts. College led to my job at Morrison's Auto Repair, where I learned that I had inherited my father's gift for seeing how things worked and figuring out how to make them work better. My boss, Frank Morrison, was a gruff man in his 60s who had been fixing cars since before computers were involved in the process, but he recognized talent when he saw it and took me under his wing like the son he'd never had. The work was honest and satisfying in a way that nothing else had ever been, giving me a sense of purpose and confidence that helped rebuild the confidence my father's departure had shattered. Frank never asked about my family background, never pried into the complicated emotions I carried about success and failure and the thin line between them. He judged me on my work and my character, two things I could control, rather than my pedigree or my potential, two things that felt like variables in an equation I'd never learned to solve. Under his guidance, I became not just a good mechanic but a gifted one, the kind of technician other shops would call when they encountered problems their own people couldn't solve. It was a small world, but it was mine, and I was good at it. Meeting Sarah had felt like winning a lottery I'd never bought a ticket for, too good to be true and too wonderful to question too deeply. She was everything I wasn't: confident, cultured, comfortable in her own skin, and in social situations that made me break out in nervous sweats. But she seemed to genuinely enjoy my company, laughed at my awkward jokes, and found my blue-collar honesty refreshing after a lifetime of country club diplomacy. Our relationship developed slowly, built on genuine affection rather than shared backgrounds or social compatibility. She never made me feel ashamed of where I came from or what I did for a living, at least not intentionally. But her family was a different story, and their disapproval hung over our relationship like storm clouds that threatened to break open at any moment. Mrs. Hartford's comments about realistic expectations and knowing your place weren't new. They were just the latest in a series of subtle put-downs designed to remind me that I was a guest in their world, tolerated but not truly welcome. Now, standing in the ballroom where I'd just been publicly humiliated, I watched my father command the attention of 200 people without saying a word. The conversations had stopped entirely, and even the kitchen staff had paused in their work to see what would happen next. He moved through the crowd with the kind of presence that money can't buy and breeding can't teach, the natural magnetism of someone who had learned to carry power lightly but wield it effectively when necessary. Mrs. Hartford had gone pale, her champagne glass now resting forgotten on the table as she stared at the man who had just transformed her daughter's wedding from a social triumph into something potentially catastrophic. I could see her mind racing, trying to calculate how badly she had miscalculated, how drastically the power dynamic in the room had just shifted. Her husband looked equally stunned, his business-minded brain probably running through every possible implication of what this unexpected arrival might mean for his family's reputation and social standing. The whispers were growing louder now, guests pulling out their phones to confirm what they thought they were seeing, to verify that the man standing in their midst was indeed who they thought he was. I caught fragments of conversation, pieces of a puzzle that was slowly revealing a picture I'd never imagined possible. Isn't that Richard Chan from Chin Industries? The billionaire who revolutionized renewable energy? I thought he was speaking at the UN Climate Summit this week. What's he doing at a wedding in Connecticut? Richard Chin. The name hit me like a physical blow, confirming what part of me had already begun to suspect, but my mind refused to accept. My father hadn't just left us to chase impossible dreams. He had caught them, transformed them into reality, built an empire that had made him one of the most influential figures in sustainable technology. The patents he'd been working on at our kitchen table, the innovations that had seemed like fantasy to a struggling family, had become the foundation of a company that was reshaping entire industries. The room seemed to tilt as I processed this information, 15 years of resentment and abandonment issues colliding with the reality of what my father had accomplished in the time since he'd walked out of our lives. He hadn't been running away from responsibility. He had been running toward a future that none of us could have imagined, carrying the burden of our financial security on his shoulders while building something that would change the world. The money that had mysteriously appeared over the years, the scholarships and opportunities that had seemed too good to be true, the way our rent had always gotten paid during Mom's sick days, it had all been him, watching over us from a distance, taking care of us in the only way we would allow. He was closer now, close enough that I could see the emotion in his eyes, the mixture of pride and regret and hope that comes with 15 years of wondering if your son will ever forgive you for the choices you had to make. Close enough to see that despite all his success, despite the empire he had built and the recognition he had earned, there was still something missing from his life, something that all his accomplishments couldn't replace. Close enough to realize that maybe, just maybe, he had been waiting for this moment as long as I had been dreading it. The crowd parted as he approached the head table where Sarah and I sat frozen in our wedding finery, two young people caught in the middle of a drama that was bigger than anything we had prepared for. Mrs. Hartford's face had gone from pale to ashen, her earlier confidence replaced by the kind of panic that comes from realizing you have just insulted the father of someone whose net worth probably exceeded the GDP of small countries. Her husband was frantically whispering to the people at his table, trying to do damage control for a situation that was spiraling far beyond his ability to manage. My father stopped a few feet away from our table, his presence filling the space between us with 15 years of unspoken words and unresolved emotions. He looked at me with eyes that held a lifetime of regret and an ocean of love, and for a moment, we were just father and son again, the way we had been before pride and circumstances and misunderstanding had driven us apart. Then he turned to face the crowd, his gaze sweeping across the 200 faces that were watching this reunion unfold, and I knew that whatever happened next would change everything forever. He walked toward the small stage where the band had been playing, where the microphone stood waiting like a weapon that could either destroy or redeem, depending on who wielded it and what they chose to say. The crowd held its collective breath as he approached the microphone stand, his movements deliberate and confident, like a man who had spent years preparing for this exact moment. Mrs. Hartford looked like she might faint, while her husband appeared to be calculating how quickly they could leave the country if necessary. My father adjusted the microphone with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to addressing large audiences, then looked out over the crowd with the kind of calm authority that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you're worth. The silence in the room was absolute, so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in my ears like thunder. Sarah squeezed my hand so tightly I thought she might break something, her eyes wide with anticipation and terror as we waited to see what 15 years of separation and success had taught the man who had given me life and then disappeared from it. He cleared his throat softly, the sound carrying clearly through the ballroom's expensive sound system, and began to speak. The first words that came from my father's mouth carried the weight of 15 years and the power to reshape everything I thought I knew about my place in the world. His voice was steady and warm, filling the ballroom with the kind of quiet authority that made even the wait staff stop what they were doing to listen. Good evening, everyone. I apologize for arriving unannounced, but when I learned that my son was getting married today, nothing in the world could have kept me away. The collective gasp from the crowd was audible, 200 people suddenly understanding that they were witnessing something far more significant than a wedding crasher making a scene. He paused, his eyes finding mine across the room, and the smile that crossed his face was the same one I remembered from childhood mornings when he would make pancakes shaped like cartoon characters and tell me stories about brave knights and wise dragons. You see, I've been watching my son's life unfold from a distance for many years now, respecting his wish that I stay away while never stopping my love for him or my pride in the man he's become. His words hit me like a physical force, knocking the breath from my lungs and threatening to bring tears I'd been holding back for over a decade. Mrs. Hartford had gone completely white, her champagne glass now forgotten on the table as she stared at the man who was systematically dismantling every assumption she'd made about my family and my worth. Her carefully constructed narrative about my humble background and limited prospects was crumbling in real time, each word from my father's mouth adding another crack to the foundation of her superiority. I could see her husband frantically trying to catch her eye, probably attempting to signal her to remain calm, but she looked like a deer caught in headlights, frozen and helpless as her world tilted off its axis. My father continued, his voice carrying easily through the expensive sound system as he addressed the crowd like he'd been born to command their attention. Some of you may know me as Richard Chin, the founder and CEO of Chin Industries. What you might not know is that everything I've built, every patent I've filed, every company I've founded, has been driven by one simple motivation: to create a legacy worthy of my son, and to ensure that the family I was forced to leave behind would never want for anything again. The murmur that rippled through the crowd was like electricity, 200 people suddenly realizing they were in the presence of one of the most successful entrepreneurs of the past 2 decades. He gestured toward me with a pride that was unmistakable, his eyes shining with emotions I'd never seen before or perhaps had been too young and hurt to recognize. My son doesn't know this, but I've been following his accomplishments for years. I know about his scholarship to community college, though he thinks it came from an anonymous foundation. I know about his exceptional work at Morrison's Auto Repair, where his innovations have improved efficiency by 30% and saved his employer hundreds of thousands of dollars. I know about the patents he's filed for automotive improvements, patents that major manufacturers are already interested in licensing. The world seemed to spin around me as I processed what he was saying. Patents? Innovations? I thought back to the ideas I'd sketched during slow days at the shop, the improvements I'd suggested to Frank, the solutions I'd developed for problems that had been plaguing the industry for years. I'd never thought of them as particularly significant, just common-sense fixes that seemed obvious to anyone who actually worked with their hands. But my father was describing them like they were revolutionary breakthroughs, like they mattered in ways I'd never imagined. Sarah's grip on my arm had loosened, and when I looked at her, I saw wonder in her eyes where there had once been uncertainty. She was seeing me through new eyes, processing the revelation that the man she'd married wasn't just a small-town mechanic, but someone whose mind worked in ways that could change industries. Her family's dismissal of my potential was being rewritten in real time, their assumptions about my limitations revealed as failures of imagination rather than accurate assessments of my capabilities. My father's voice grew stronger as he continued, carrying the conviction of a man who had spent years building toward this moment. I left my family 15 years ago not because I didn't love them, but because I loved them too much to watch them struggle while I had the power to change our circumstances. It was the hardest decision I've ever made, and not a day has passed that I haven't questioned whether I made the right choice. But seeing my son today, seeing the man he's become despite my absence, seeing the love he's found and the respect he's earned, I know that everything I sacrificed was worth it. The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word like they were witnessing a moment that would be talked about for years to come. Even the photographers had stopped taking pictures, too caught up in the emotion of the moment to remember their professional duties. This wasn't just a wedding speech, it was a public vindication, a father's love letter to a son he'd been forced to love from a distance, and a correction of the record for anyone who had ever questioned my worth or my place in the world. Mrs. Hartford looked like she might be sick, her face cycling through shades of embarrassment and panic as she realized the magnitude of her miscalculation. The woman who had spent months making subtle digs about my background and prospects was now faced with the reality that she had been insulting the son of a billionaire, someone whose innovations were already changing the world in ways her own family could never dream of matching. Her husband was whispering frantically in her ear, probably calculating how much damage control would be necessary to salvage their reputation from this spectacular misjudgment. My father turned to address Mrs. Hartford directly, his voice remaining respectful but carrying an undertone of steel that made it clear he had heard every word of her earlier speech. "Mrs. Hartford, I understand you advised my son to know his place in this world. Allow me to clarify what that place is. He is the heir to a renewable energy empire worth several $billion, a brilliant innovator whose ideas are already being implemented by major corporations, and a young man whose integrity and work ethic put most people to shame." The silence that followed his words was so complete it felt like the entire world had stopped breathing. He continued, his gaze sweeping across the crowd to ensure his message was heard by everyone present. More importantly, he is a man who chose to work with his hands and support his mother rather than take the easy path his inheritance could have provided. He is someone who earned Sarah's love through his character rather than his bank account, who chose to build a life based on his own efforts rather than rely on family wealth. That kind of integrity is rarer and more valuable than all the money in the world. The tears I'd been holding back for 15 years finally broke free, streaming down my face as I listened to my father defend not just my worth but my choices, validating the path I'd taken even when it seemed small and insignificant compared to the world Sarah came from. He wasn't just revealing his success. He was celebrating mine, finding value in the humble life I'd built and the honest,